A lot happened for me in 2023, so this will act as a sort of update video, and one that is ridiculously late, so I apologize in advance for that. I'll start with some fighting game stuff. This was definitely my busiest year for traveling to tournaments. I did okay this year overall. My performance at CEO was disappointing for sure, doing as poorly as top 12%, but I did have a pretty strong showing at EVO Las Vegas, finishing at top 2%, and I think that's the real big one that matters. I also had a pretty good match on stream at EVO Japan, even if I didn't win, but it was still an awesome experience. I tried participating in Granblue Fantasy Versus and Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, but that stint was short-lived. I clearly have no clue what I'm doing in those games, although I did make it surprisingly far in Granblue at CEO. I also participated in official tournaments for Breaker's Revenge at CEO and Air Guys at CEO Taku, and I did well enough to get finalist medals in both games. It was surreal to play Air Guys at a major tournament, since that's a childhood game of mine, and I can't believe I got as far as second place. With Breaker's Revenge, it's hilarious to me that I never even heard of this fighting game from 1996 before I got a free copy to do a review of, and then the very same year I get 7th place and a CEO finalist medal. It might sound dumb to some people, but I'm actually kind of proud that I managed to get top 8 at 2 majors, even if they were in games that no one really plays. As an aside, I have great friends who live in Illinois, so I always try to make time to visit while I'm in the area for Frosty Faustings and Combo Breaker. When I went to visit this time, I finally got the chance to play Silent Hill the arcade. Turns out, it kind of sucks. But I'm glad I could finally knock that rare game off of my bucket list, as well as several others I've been wanting to play like Radmobile. If you've never been to Galloping Ghost Arcade, it's amazing. Highly recommended for any arcade or classic video game enthusiast. And thanks a bunch to my buddy Sticky Rick for being a good host and a great friend. Check out his YouTube channel, he's got some great stuff. When I went to visit Japan, it was so awesome. I ate at the Monster Hunter restaurant, I checked out the Omocat corner at a store called Park in Harajuku, I got this awesome Mei figure at a secondhand shop, I love this thing. By some crazy coincidence, Gerald Lee of the YouTube channel Kore Gaming seemed to have been staying at my very same hotel. I bumped into him and we chatted for a bit. I'm sure he won't remember me, but it would be cool to cross paths with him again one day. He's a super chill and cool guy, and I'd love the opportunity to talk to him some more. That's about it for my tournament and traveling talk. At this point, I've pretty much done everything with fighting games that I care to do, and I've gone way further than I expected. I got a couple of top 8 finalist medals, I did well at EVO, I've been to Japan, and I've traveled to a few states in the US. If I decided to retire now, then I think I'd be comfortable with that. I really do wish I could go back to focusing more on my reviews. I will say that I still love Guilty Gear Strive, despite how much I complain about it, and I want to take the opportunity to keep playing the game and participating in tournaments while the community is still active. But I might finally drop the game and the genre entirely sooner than later. I don't know, nothing is set in stone, so we'll see. As for Granblue, I've kept trying to get into the game, and I've been playing the newest Rising version a lot lately, but I just don't understand the game's rules, and I'm not finding it all that fun at the moment. I plan to have a review made for it eventually, so I'll have more thoughts on that then. I do think it's a good game, it's just not for me. Alright, on to the reviews that I did in 2023, starting with the movies. I was looking forward to The Night House because Christine is probably my favorite movie, and I think Rebecca Hall is a great actress. But this one didn't really do it for me. It's fine, and it has a neat premise, but the direction the story goes in is kind of lame, and it doesn't wrap up in a particularly satisfying way. The visuals and effects are very nice, as are the acting and dialogue, but the movie as a whole despite how creative it is, doesn't really have a whole lot going for it. It's hard for me to decide on which movie is better, The Night House or Top Gun Maverick, but at the very least, the final act of Maverick is pretty cool. While Maverick has better storytelling, it's also a lot less creative and plays it very safe. It does just enough to hold your attention, and while it doesn't really take any risks, at least it doesn't fall apart like Night House does. This one quickly rocketed up the list for me as a favorite anime. The characters and world are awesome, the animation and art are really nice, and it stands out as a very unique story. Made in Abyss is a pretty effective deconstruction of the fantasy adventure genre. That said, it probably tries too hard to be edgy and uncomfortable, especially in the movie, but it's not necessarily without reason, and I feel like it was still pulled off well. Because of how intertwined the movie is to the show, I'm basically grouping the two of them together here, but if I had to pick one or the other, then I'd say the show is stronger than the movie. Not only is the movie extra edgy, it has some over-the-top action scenes that make it feel a little bit off-tone. Regardless, I still do love it all. I had meant to watch and review Season 2 for the end of 2023, but life got really busy for me towards the tail end of that year, so I'm simply going to have to put that off for the time being. I'll talk more about that later. But for now, I'll go over the 16 games that I reviewed last year, starting with, oh boy, Succubus with guns. Whenever it's from publisher Sometimes You know it's gonna be a treat. Bad controls, mismatched visuals, and the gameplay is boring as hell. There isn't even anything titillating about this, despite what the game would have you believe. Like I said in the review, even as a joke, it's not worth playing. There's really nothing here. Not the worst game I've ever played, not by a long shot, but it's not for a lack of trying. Another Sometimes You game, but at least this one's a simple and straightforward platformer. It sets out what it wants to do, and it doesn't do it well, but it is a platformer that functions, I'll give it that. But there's hardly any content to it, and certainly nothing interesting to see here at all. Even the boss fights fail to impress. This should have been a free game as part of the developer's personal portfolio, not sold for cash. More and more of the same. A basically nothing game with too little content. But at least the general design concept is somewhat interesting here. You can tell that a tiny attempt was made, which puts it leagues above the previous games on this list, but that's still not saying much. You can easily ignore this one without losing any sleep. I was really looking forward to this game, but it is riddled with so many glitches to the point that it's nearly unplayable. And this is the supposed post-early access release. Worst of all is that my data keeps erasing itself randomly, and I hear that the PC release has a similar issue as well. The atmosphere, writing, and general concept are great, but you really have to put up with a lot just to make this game work. At its foundation, World of Horror deserves to be much higher on this list, but it's currently in a state that clearly isn't ready for market, and I'm not gonna recommend it on those grounds. The general look and sort of feel of Primal Light almost makes it come across like a legitimate retro game of a bygone era. However, there is a significant lack of polish, in particular with the enemy reactions, and some of the level design is made to be stupidly cheap and mean on purpose. You'll need to have a lot of patience just to get used to this game, and even once you do, it's not like you're getting much of a reward out of it. I mean, hell, it's not even 2 hours long. But the boss fights are kind of fun in terms of pattern recognition, and the game does have its moments. I enjoyed it enough to just barely give it somewhat of a pass, but I certainly wouldn't give this a recommendation. Let me be clear, this game isn't necessarily good enough to be this high on the list, but it is one of the more noteworthy and memorable games that I've played. It does help that I'm a fan of the anime, and I can recognize that the game does a good job with presenting the world, so admittedly, there is a little bit of a bias here. However, more interestingly, it also integrates survival elements into its gameplay in surprisingly effective ways, and in such a way that it doesn't bog down the pacing. Pretty much anyone who plays this game seriously will likely have a similar experience randomly occur. They'll get in over their head, climb too deeply into the abyss, and have a massive struggle trying to make it back home, trying their best to avoid reloading a previous save, but those who do pull it off will discover a newfound appreciation for the game's mechanics as a whole. Unfortunately, the combat is bad, mechanics aren't very well explained, and there is a ton of repetition. The game just isn't very good. But you can tell that an attempt of sorts was made, and the game is rather interesting and unique. I sure wish it could have been better, but this is actually a case where I'd rather have bad as opposed to nothing at all, which can be rare coming from me. Mario Wonder was easily the greatest disappointment I played this year and in quite some time. The controls are great, but that doesn't mean much when the level design and obstacles are worthless. The badge system is really neat in how it offers new abilities, but it's also pointless due to how the game isn't balanced around these overpowered abilities at all. What should have been a simple continuation of the new Super Mario series ended up being one of the most boring games I played this year, and that's something I never thought I'd say about Mario. God of Rock merges the music, rhythm, and fighting genres surprisingly well, although it was missing button remapping for the console port, but that seems to have been added in a patch. However, even so, little things like the poor heads-up display make a big difference, and the game is kind of lacking, but I can see the potential for people who are willing to get into it. Hopefully they've added in private lobbies and spectating by now. I haven't bothered to check, personally, and it'd be a shame if this game never gets a chance in a competitive scene and online tournaments simply due to developer or publisher incompetence. Batboy has the right idea, and it almost nails the concept, but the lacking challenge makes the game a little bit boring, and the bloat of abilities is pointless, dumb, and unbalanced. It's not bad. It's just a simple, bare-bones 8-bit inspired platformer that doesn't do anything special. That's fine, I guess, I did enjoy it, but I'd like a lot more out of my games. What it lacks in the polish that other fighting games of the era would have had, Breaker's Revenge does manage to make up for it in having a solid foundation as a fighting game. Unfortunately, really bare-bones features, like your bog-standard arcade mode, leave a lot to desire, and the addition of a new team battle mode doesn't really mean all that much. Worst of all, the online versus is just not good at all. You're much better off playing this on Fightcade for free. However, the game itself is pretty fun, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to play it in a major tournament at CEO 2023. I've been interested in Returnal for quite a while, and I'm glad that I finally played it. But I should have known better than to get my hopes up for a roguelike. Too random, too repetitive, and just plain obnoxious in the worst ways. It's definitely one of my favorite roguelikes, if only for the fantastic controls, level design, and enemy variety, and I'd certainly like to revisit it sometime, but it isn't a game that made a really strong impression and just left me feeling kind of empty. It's so nuts to me that pretty much all of my complaints with Pokemon from my Pokemon Shield review were addressed in this one single game. 2 versus 2 battles are the norm, your monsters can have way more moves, and elemental dominance is still important, but without being the main determining factor, on top of so many other things that makes this game a blast to play. There is a lot that brings this game down, like a somewhat lackluster story, the combat is imbalanced with fusions and items being way too strong, the info on capturing and evolving some monsters is annoyingly cryptic, and there's no multiplayer, which is a huge letdown. However, at the end of the day, at its core, this is Pokemon, but better. A lot better. And I respect it for that. Granblue is an interesting one for me to comment on. On the surface, it quickly became a favorite of mine, with its traditional pacing for a fighting game, but utilizing a simplified approach to help with accessibility. Unfortunately, its online netcode is horrible, so that puts it far behind other fighting games these days. However, since I've been playing the new Rising update with a netcode that actually works, I have other opinions on the game now that I can actually play against a variety of other people online. I still think it's a good game, but similar to Melty Blood, there are a bunch of small factors that add up to being pretty big annoyances, and it's just not the game for me. The story campaign is a neat idea, but it's quite flawed, and even if it wasn't, that would hardly be enough to make up for the rest of the game's faults. Not a bad game at all though. It serves a particular fighting game niche quite well, and I do recommend it for anyone interested. I got into Melty Blood for its fast pace, easy controls, and hectic neutral, but I dropped it soon after I learned about its more advanced mechanics like rebeats and how incredibly important the Okizeme pressure is. That said, if you want an alternative of sorts to the crazy speed and action of something like Marvel vs. Capcom, then I'd say this is an interesting game to look into. The shield mechanic will certainly be a sticking point for many, but I feel like the game as a whole does a good job with what it sets out to do. The single player content isn't half bad either, at least as far as typical fighting game single player stuff goes, and the online netcode works great. So yeah, this is a pretty good fighting game that's got just about everything you need. It's been a long time, way too long, since I played a horror game that can rival the likes of the best classic Resident Evil or Silent Hill entries, and this one is finally it. Good level design, great puzzles, and fantastic atmosphere that sucks you in. The story is ridiculously out there and only gets more confusing as it goes along, but the overall presentation does make up for it. The combat is a little janky, but it works well enough for what they're going for. One of my specific complaints, how the eyeball and flashlight accessories pointlessly take up additional inventory space, has been rectified in a patch, which is nice, but of course the game as a whole hasn't been rebalanced with this in mind, so if you use that option, it just makes everything a whole lot easier. This game is far from perfect, but for a little indie game that clearly tries its best, it's just fine. It won't appeal to everyone, but if you want to return to classic survival horror, then Signalis is truly the one. A must-play for fans of the genre. As for a game that pretty much does appeal to everyone, the legendary Resident Evil 4 still manages to stand tall even 19 years later. The controls may take getting used to, especially due to a lack of strafing and the strict tank control movement, but they're undeniably tight and precise. The opposition is balanced around the player's limitations too, with slow but powerful and threatening enemies. And an arsenal of different weapons allow the player to approach a given situation the way they want to. It's challenging, but also reasonably fair, for the most part, on top of the full-length adventure being surprisingly robust, plus all the additional content besides. The controversial dynamic difficulty and random elements is something I'm not necessarily happy about, but it does manage to stay hidden enough that it never actually bothered me. And, even so, all the positives far outweigh the negatives. Good enemy variety, good level design, fun bosses, good controls, player customization, The action, the pacing, the presentation, even the voice acting is great with the cheesy mood that it goes for. It is such a good package as a whole that there is no denying this as a truly legendary game of its generation, and it is still well worth playing even today. Alright, that's it. That was the end of 2023, coming at you extremely late. I haven't released a new review in about 3 months, and honestly, I wouldn't expect that pace to improve anytime soon. Here's the current plan. I'm gonna focus pretty hard on fighting games for most of the year, and then afterwards, we'll see. I want to get at least 2 more reviews finished sometime in 2024, Resident Evil 4 Remake and Granblue Fantasy vs. Rising, but I don't want to make any promises. I don't want to make it sound like I'll quit making videos because anyone who knows me knows that making reviews has been a huge passion of mine since I was in, like, high school at the latest, and it's been a great journey for me so far. I've made some of my best friends from people who have watched my videos, and I've learned a lot about writing, editing, and composing arguments. It's just that, at the moment, my life has been keeping me quite busy, but in a good way though. Hopefully I can get back on track to making reviews again at some point, and on a more consistent schedule like before. I'll keep streaming each week just because that's pretty easy to keep up with, and if you got any questions for me, then that's usually a good time to ask, as long as you're willing to wait for me to catch up with the chat. Anyway, that's enough out of me. Thanks for watching, and thanks for keeping up with all of my nonsense over the past 6.5 years or so.
Ready, set!